Good morning. Thank you for joining me today. This morning we'll be in John chapter 6, verses 1 through 21. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd was following him because they were observing the miraculous signs he was performing on the sick. So Jesus went on up the mountainside and sat down there with his disciples. Now, the Jewish feast of the Passover was near. Then Jesus, when he looked up and saw that a large crowd was coming to him, said to Philip, "Where can we buy bread so that these people may eat?" Now Jesus said this to test him, for he knew what he was going to do. Philip replied, 200 silver coins worth of bread would not be enough for them, for each one to get a little. One of Jesus' disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "Here's a boy who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what good are these for so many people?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was a lot of grass in that place. So the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed the bread for those who were seated. He then did the same with the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were all satisfied, Jesus said to his disciples, "Gather up the broken pieces that are left over, so that nothing is wasted." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with broken pieces from the 5 barley loaves left over by the people who had eaten. Now when the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus performed, they began to say to one another, "This is certainly the prophet who is to come into the world." Then Jesus, because he knew they were going to come and seize him by force to make him king, withdrew again up into the mountainside alone. Now when evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, got into a boat, and started to cross the lake to Capernaum. It had already become dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. By now a strong wind was blowing, and the sea was getting rough. Then, when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they caught sight of Jesus walking on the lake, approaching the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat came to the land where they had been heading. So, here you have Jesus feeding the 5,000 miraculously, and also walking on the water. And Jesus is, in response to him feeding the 5,000, you have the people saying about him, "This is certainly the prophet who is to come into the world," which I think would be the prophecy from Moses, who said that a prophet is coming after me. And I think that this would have been confirmed by the fact that Moses, as he was going through the wilderness, not through his provision, but by the provision of God, there was manna that rained down from heaven, so that the children of Israel were provided food in the middle of the desert. And so too you have here Jesus miraculously providing food for the people, thus further aiding the the idea that he's the prophet to come. And indeed he was, and is. But his kingdom isn't of this world. And so when they tried to seize him by force to make him king, he withdrew. Yeah. And then, subsequent to this, you have Jesus displaying his control over the water, just as God parted the Red Sea for the Israelites to go through. So too Jesus here displays command over the very waters themselves. So, let's see what Guzik has to say. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, John now records some of the acts and words of Jesus in the Galilee region, north of Judea. John mainly recorded things that Jesus did and said in Judea and Jerusalem, but sometimes included material that the other gospel writers also wrote of, mainly in the Galilee region. Then a great multitude followed him. This miracle is also recorded in the other three gospel accounts. Luke mentioned that on this occasion, Jesus went out to a deserted place to be alone, yet the crowds followed him there, in spite of this imposition. Jesus still served the multitude with great compassion. They saw his signs which he performed on those who were diseased. Luke 9:11 tells us that Jesus also taught this multitude, something that John doesn't specifically mention. Morris gives the sense of the Greek verbs of John 6:2. The multitude kept following Jesus because they continually saw the signs that he habitually did on the sick, from Morris. The Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. John is the only one of the four gospel writers who told us this took place near the time of the Passover. Perhaps this great multitude was made up of Galilean pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem. Passover is associated with the Exodus and God's sustenance of Israel in the wilderness. Jesus would soon sustain this multitude in their small wilderness with bread from heaven, both literally and spiritually. In this time of Passover, they would have had on mind the Exodus. And so I bet they felt it more acutely that Jesus is providing food for them in the wilderness. And went up on the mountain. The high ground is the sharply rising terrain east of the lake, well known today as the Golan Heights. From there, one overlooks the level plain east of the river and the lake, from Bruce. Where shall we buy bread that these may eat? Perhaps Jesus asked Philip this question because he was from Bethsaida, and this was near where this miracle took place. John does not say, as Mark does, that the crowd had been listening to Jesus teaching all day, but this explains his concern about feeding them. He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Jesus knew what miracle he was about to perform, but wanted to use the opportunity to teach his disciples. For Jesus, this wasn't only about getting a job done, feeding the multitude, but also about teaching his disciples along the way. Philip had already seen Jesus do many miracles. There should have been no question to him about the divine resources Jesus had. 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient. Their problem was in at least two parts. First, they didn't have the resources to buy bread and to feed the multitude. Second, even if they had the money, it would be impossible to purchase enough bread to feed them all. With greater faith and knowledge, Philip might have said, "Master, I don't know where the food is to feed this crowd, but you are greater than Moses, whom God used to feed a multitude every day in the wilderness, and God can certainly do a lesser work through a greater servant. You are greater than Elisha, whom God used to feed many sons of the prophets through little food. What is more, the scriptures say that man shall not live by bread alone, and you are great enough to fill this multitude from the words of your mouth." 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them. Philip's knowledge of the situation was accurate and impressive. 200 denarii is more than 6 months' wages, but his knowledge was useless in getting the problem solved. Philip thought in terms of money, and how much money it would take to carry out God's work in a small way. Every one of them may have a little. We often limit God the same way, looking for how God's work can be done in the smallest way. Jesus wanted to use a completely different approach and provide in a big way. He was a man of figures. He believed in what could be put into tables and statistics. Yes, and like a great man, other people of his sort, he left out one small element in his calculation, and that was Jesus Christ. And so his answer went creeping along the low levels, from Maclaren. Philip was apparently a matter-of-fact person. John 14:8, a quick reckoner and good man of business, and therefore more ready to rely on his own shrewd calculations than on unseen resources, from Dodds. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a lad here." Andrew once again introduced someone to Jesus. First it was his brother Peter, now it was a lad, with some barley loaves and 2 small fish. The word for lad is a double diminutive, probably meaning little boy. 5 barley loaves. Barley was always regarded as simple food, more often fit for animals than for people. This means it is likely that the young boy came from a poor family. In the Talmud, there is a passage where one man said, "There is a fine crop of barley," and another man answered, "Tell it to the horses and donkeys." Barley scarcely bore 1/3 of the value of wheat in the East. It was very mean fare. Appears from Ezekiel 13:19, where the false prophetesses are said to pollute the name of God for handfuls of barley, i.e., for the meanest reward. From Clark. And 2 small fish. While the other evangelists use the ordinary word for fish, ichthys, John calls them asperia, indicating that they were 2 small, perhaps salted fish, to be eaten as a relish along with the cakes of barley. From Bruce. What are they among so many? There wasn't much to work with, but God doesn't need much. In fact, God doesn't need any help, but he often deliberately restrains his work until he has our participation. Small things are not always contemptible. It all depends on the hands in which they are. From Taylor. Make the people sit down. Jesus was in no panic or hurry. He had a huge catering job to fulfill, but went about his work in an orderly way, making them sit down upon the grass. One might say that Jesus here fulfilled the role of the loving shepherd in Psalm 23:1-2. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. That psalm also gave the picture of the Lord as a host, serving a meal to his servant as a guest. You prepare a table before me. You anoint my head with oil, my cup runs over. I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Yeah, but I had also heard something interesting from Anthony Rogers lately about this being about Jesus too, in that you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Jesus was in the midst of his of the one who would betray him during the Passover meal. The men sat down in number, about 5,000. Jesus administered everything in an orderly way, yet they had to come under Jesus' order to receive Jesus' miraculous power. The one who came under Jesus' order would soon be filled to the full. Our blessed Master has glorious leisure because he is always punctual. Late people are in a hurry, but he, being never late, never hurries. From Spurgeon. When he had given thanks, Jesus only had a few loaves of bread and a few fish, but he was determined to give his Father thanks for what he did have. For 5 little cakes and 2 sprats, Christ gave thanks to the Father, apparently a meager cause for praise, but Jesus knew that he could make what he could make of them, and therefore gave thanks for what they would presently accomplish. God loves us, says Augustine, for what we are becoming. Christ gave thanks for these trifles, because he saw whereunto they would grow. From Spurgeon. Jesus took the loaves. He distributed them to the disciples. The miracle resided in the hands of Jesus, not in the distribution. Little is much in his hands. A moment ago they belonged to this lad, but now they belong to Christ. Jesus took the loaves. He has taken possession of them. They are his property. From Spurgeon. The multiplication of the food was obviously not done with great fanfare. From Tenney. This is so true that we aren't told specifically where the multiplication happened. It seems to have happened as Jesus broke the bread and fish and distributed them to the people, to the disciples. It was not the integral loaves or integral fish that were multiplied, but the broken portions of them. Most everyone ate and was filled, but had no idea that a miracle was happening. The disciples did not do the miracle, they simply distributed the miraculous work of Jesus. Good point. Bread comes from grain, which has the power of multiplication and reproduction within itself. But when it is made into bread, the grain is crushed, making it dead. No one ever multiplied wheat by planting flour, yet Jesus can bring life from death. He multiplied loaves of bread made from dead, crushed grain and from dead fish. These 5 loaves, by a strange kind of arithmetic, were multiplied by division and augmented by subtraction. From Trapp. He distributed them to the disciples. Jesus relied on the labor of the disciples in this great miracle. He could have created bread and fish in the pocket or bag of every person, but he didn't. Jesus deliberately chose a method that brought the disciples into the work. Jesus refused to miraculously make bread to feed himself in the wilderness temptations, but he did for others, and with others, what he would not do for himself. as much as they wanted. God's supply was extravagant, as much as any of them wanted. All ate until they were completely satisfied. For the significance of this story, we must bear in mind that the figure of eating and drinking is widely used in the Old Testament. It is a figure of prosperity, and it is often used of the blessings the people of God would enjoy in the Promised Land. From Morris. As much as they wanted also included the little boy who gave the 5 loaves and 2 fish. The boy himself ended up with more than he started with. It certainly was an adequate lunch for himself, but he gave it to Jesus, and he, in turn, turned it into an all-you-can-eat buffet for the boy as well. When they were filled, Jesus was generous, giving everyone as much as they wanted. This was a remarkable miracle, and some think that the disciples should have, or could have, anticipated that Jesus would do such a thing. Old Testament passages warn against doubting God's provision. Yet they spoke against God. They said, "Can God prepare a table in the wilderness?" From Psalm 78:19. 2 Kings 4:38 through 44 is an example of God multiplying barley loaves, though this miracle of Jesus was on a much greater scale. Though the disciples did not understand or anticipate the miracle, Jesus invited them to participate in it. They distributed the miraculously multiplied bread and fish. Without their work, no one would have been fed. Jesus demonstrated to them the giving character of God, the same character God desires to build within us. Proverbs 11:24 says, "There is one who scatters, yet increases more, and there is one who withholds more than is right, but it leads to poverty. This bread was multiplied as it was scattered." Gather up the fragments that remain so that nothing is lost. Jesus was generous, but never wasteful. Jesus wanted to make good use of everything. The fragments are not the half-eaten morsels and crumbs, which might well be left for birds and beasts, but the broken portions, which he handed out for distribution. The term used for basket, kophanos, usually denotes a large basket, such as might be used for fish or bulky objects. When they had seen the sign that Jesus did, the way Jesus provided bread for a multitude in the open air, something of a wilderness, reminded those men of how God worked through Moses to feed Israel with manna in the wilderness. Truly, this is the prophet. Moses predicted the coming of the prophet. They expected, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst, from your brethren. Him shall you hear." If the coming prophet was to be like Moses, it made sense that he would also feed the people miraculously as Moses did. The crowd was willing to support Jesus so long as he gave them what they wanted, bread. It's easy to criticize how the crowd loves Jesus for the bread he gave them, but we often only love Jesus for what he gives us. We must also love and obey him simply for who he is, Lord and God. A rabbi of a later date is credited with the observation that as the first Redeemer caused manna to descend, so will the last Redeemer cause manna to descend, and the general idea seems to have been current in the first century. They were about to come and take him by force to make him king. King was a political title. The crowd was willing to support Jesus because they wanted to use him to throw off Roman oppression, either directly in Judea or indirectly through Herod Antipas in Galilee. Suddenly, there was this unusual man, Jesus. He had miraculous power, so they must have said something like this to themselves: "Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could get him on our side and get him to help us drive out the Romans?" From Boise. If the Galileans did not live directly under Roman control, as their brethren in Judea did, their ruler Herod Antipas was a creature of Rome, and they experienced no feelings of patriotic pride as they contemplated their Herodian dynasty. From Bruce. But he departed again to a mountain by himself alone. Jesus wasn't impressed or seduced by a crowd that wanted to make him king. He turned his back on the crowd and went to pray because Jesus was more interested in being with his Father in heaven than in hearing the applause of the crowd. But to Jesus, the prospect of an earthly kingdom was nothing else than a temptation of the devil, and he decisively rejected it. From Morris. Yeah, certainly. If any of us were in this situation, that would be a huge amount of peer pressure. He saw the crowds were in great excitement and were meaning to come and violently carry him off and declare him their king and Messiah in opposition to civil power. Perhaps already he saw his disciples beginning to be caught in that wild enthusiasm. From Trench. He who is already king has come to open his kingdom to men, But in their blindness, men try to force him to be the kind of king they want. Thus they fail to get the king they want, and also lose the kingdom he offers. From Morris. Yeah, if you're going to make somebody king, you don't then get to pick what things he has for you to do. What kind of a kingdom he's to run, because that's the decision of the king, not yours. His disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat. Matthew and Mark tell us that Jesus made his disciples get into the boat. They set off across the Sea of Galilee because Jesus told them to do it. According to Mark 6:45, Jesus compelled Enenkazo, his disciples, to embark and go back across the lake. Perhaps he saw that they were being infected with the crowd's excitement. From Bruce. Yeah, I could see. It says the crowd whips into a mob, of, like trying to get Jesus to become king. Jesus shouts at his disciples to get in the boat and go across the sea there. And Jesus goes off to the mountains. It was already dark. Several of the disciples were fishermen, all accustomed to fishing on this very lake. When they got into the boat, the thought of rowing across the lake at night did not concern them. Jesus had not come to them. This actually was the second time Jesus dealt with his disciples on the stormy Sea of Galilee. In the first storm, Jesus was present with them in the boat, and he rebuked and calmed the storm. In this storm, Jesus asked his disciples to trust his unseen care and concern for them. Then the sea arose. The wind alone was bad enough, but the wind also whipped up the waters, making for troublesome seas. And a great wind was blowing. The Sea of Galilee was, and is well known for its sudden, violent windstorms that quickly make the lake dangerous. The Sea of Galilee is 600 feet below sea level, in a cup-like depression among the hills. When the sun sets, the air cools, and as the cooler air from the west rushes down over the hillside, the resultant wind churns the lake. Since the disciples were rowing toward Capernaum, they were heading into the wind. Consequently, they made little progress. From Tenney. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, in the first storm upon the Sea of Galilee, the disciples were terrified. In the beginning of the second storm, they were more frustrated than afraid. Jesus told them to row across the lake, and despite their hard work, they seemed to make little progress. Matthew 14:25. This happened in the 4th watch of the night, sometime between 3 and 6 in the morning. So they rowed hard for perhaps 6 to 8 hours, and had only come a little more than halfway across the lake. They were in this place of frustration at the will of Jesus, doing exactly what he told them to do. Additionally, Mark 6:48 says that Jesus watched the disciples as they rowed across the lake. His eye was on them all the time. They were in the will of Jesus and watched by Jesus, yet working hard in frustration all the time. Up on the hillside, Jesus had prayed and communed with God. As he set out, the silver moon had made the scene almost like the daylight, and down on the lake he could see the boat with the rowers toiling at the oars. He had not forgotten. He was not too busy with God to think of them. From Barclay. He is on the mountain while we are on the sea. The stable eternity of the heavens holds him. We are tossed on the restless mutability of time, over which we toil at his command. Yeah, but God's ultimately got it under control. And they saw Jesus walking on the sea, and they were afraid. Says that Mark 6:49-50 says the disciples were afraid because they thought Jesus walking on the water was a ghost or a spirit. Mark adds the remarkable detail that Jesus meant to pass by them, that is, overtaking, as though he had wished that the mere vision of himself should prove sufficient support and assurance to them. The disciples were not ready for any kind of supernatural help. They knew what Jesus commanded them to do, and they set out to do it, but without any direct help from Jesus. So they were surprised and afraid to see supernatural help coming to them. Jesus also gave them reasons and reminders to trust his supernatural help. Undoubtedly, they took with them at least some of the 12 baskets of leftover bread, yet they were still shocked when the supernatural help came to them on the sea. It is I. For Jesus, it was enough to announce his presence. He was with his disciples and would meet them in their frustration and fear. There are places in this gospel where the words ego e me have the nature of a divine designation, but here they simply mean it is I. From 6:20. I don't know, because Jesus here intends to pass by them, like pass over them, and then he announces to them his name, which also reminds me of Moses when he wanted to see the glory of the Lord, and the Lord saying to him, "You can't see my glory and live," essentially, but you'll be hidden in the face of the rock, and I'll pass by you and declare my name to you, type thing. And in the same way, you have Jesus passing by the disciples and declaring his name to them. This ego eimi, Yahweh, I am that which I am. Do not be afraid. Jesus came to bring supernatural help and comfort to his disciples. His presence gave them what they needed, even though he came in an unexpected way. We know from Matthew 14:28-32, that after this, Peter asked Jesus if he could come out and walk on the water, and Peter did walk on the water for a short time. Then they willingly received him into the boat. The implication was that Jesus would not come unless he was willingly received. Even walking on the Sea of Galilee, Jesus waited to be welcomed by his disciples. Immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. When they had willingly received him into the boat, the miraculous happened. This was a remarkable miracle. The work that was so frustrating a few moments before suddenly was divinely accomplished. From this detail given by John, it is inferred that the ship seemed to move automatically without sail or oar, in obedience to his will, so that without effort of the disciples or crew, it quickly passed over the remaining distance, 2 miles or so, and came to shore. One could say that Jesus rescued his disciples from frustration and futility. Jesus wants us to work hard, but he never wants us to work in futility. Their work had not been a waste, but it waited for the touch of divine power and presence. And immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. Such a remarkable miracle was helpful for the disciples, especially because Jesus had just refused an offer to be recognized as a king Messiah. This assured them that he was full of divine power, even though he did not claim a throne, according to popular expectation and opinion. How far they were from the place at which they landed when our Lord came to them, we know not, but the evangelist seems to speak of their sudden arrival there as extraordinary and miraculous, from Clark. A dying saint hath no sooner taken death into his bosom, but he is immediately landed at the quay of Canaan, at the kingdom of heaven, from Trapp. Yeah, and I think this is an easy miracle to pass over, because it just happened so fast in the text. Immediately the boat was where they were going. Little fanfare is given to it, just like the splitting of the bread and the fish. But despite the simplicity of it, it shows divine power. Anyway, carrying on, Psalm 106, verses 13-31. They quickly forgot what he had done. This is the children of Israel. They did not wait for his instructions. In the wilderness, they had an insatiable craving for meat. They challenged God in the desert. He granted their request, then struck them with a disease. In the camp, they resented Moses and Aaron, the Lord's holy priest. The earth opened up and swallowed Dathan. It engulfed the group led by Abiram. Fire burned their group. The flames scorched the wicked. They made an image of a calf at Horeb and worshipped a metal idol. They traded their majestic God for the image of an ox that eats grass. They rejected the God who delivered them, the one who performed great deeds in Egypt. Amazing feats in the land of Ham, mighty acts by the Red Sea. He threatened to destroy them, but Moses, his chosen one, interceded with him and turned back his destructive anger. They rejected the fruitful land. They did not believe his promise. They grumbled in their tents. They did not obey the Lord. So he made a solemn vow that he would make them die in the desert, make their descendants die among the nations, and scatter them among foreign lands. They worshipped Baal of Peor and ate sacrifices offered to the dead. They made the Lord angry by their actions, and a plague broke out among them. Phinehas took a stand and intervened, and the plague subsided. This brought him a reward, an eternal gift. Yeah, this seems to kind of stand in contrast with the previous psalm, where it reflects on God's goodness and provision, how he's watched out for his people, how he's provided for them, and continues to provide for them in desolate places and under desperate circumstances. But despite that, they quickly forgot what he had done, and they did not wait for his instructions, type thing. And they rejected God who delivered them, the one who performed great deeds in Egypt. Rather than contemplating on God's past provision for them, rather than waiting on God's provision for them in the present, they reject him. They complain about him. They don't believe that what he says is true, that he will deliver them into the promised land. And so they resort to their own instruments. They make an image of a golden calf. They resent the leadership that God puts in place, Moses and Aaron, and elect leaders for themselves, like the Dathan and Abiram, who want to be the leaders of Israel. Rather than worship God for who he is, they make an image of God that instead, in the likeness of a ox that eats grass. Yeah. And so God punishes them for what they've done. And this not being out of a vindictive nature of God, but rather in an attempt to bring them back to him. Yeah, but I think this shows just how much waywardness we have, how we don't want to be faithful to the God who has constantly provided for us, and would rather choose our own devices. And finally, Proverbs chapter 14, verses 32 and 33. The wicked will be thrown down in his trouble, but the righteous have refuge even in the threat of death. Wisdom rests in the heart of the discerning. It is known even in the heart of fools. Yeah, so when there's trouble, essentially, the wicked won't survive it. But the righteous have refuge even in the threat of death. God is the shield of the righteous, essentially. And 1433 is kind of interesting. Wisdom rests in the heart of the discerning, and this is known even in the heart of fools. That is, I guess that even a fool can recognize the wisdom in the heart of the wise. Or, I guess here, what is in the heart of fools is made known. And the wisdom of a wise man's heart will be revealed, so will the folly of a fool's heart. What we are is eventually evident in what we do. Yeah. Anywho, thank you so much for joining me today. Hope you have a great day. Bye.